My parents said, "You are not the favorite. Deal with it." I found out why it was like that, because my grandfather. Hello, Reddit. Before I get into this, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button, give this a like, and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel out, especially since most people don't watch these stories all the way through. So here goes. My name is Oliver. I'm 26 now, and I've always been the second son. Not just by birth order, but by everything. I was born into a house that had already picked a favorite, and it sure as hell wasn't me. My older brother, Derek, is 2 years older. From the moment I could walk, it was clear he was the golden child. He could get away with anything. And I mean anything. One time when we were kids, I must have been 8, so Derek was 10, he tried to make a ramp for his bike using my skateboard and a stack of bricks. It collapsed, he face-planted, and somehow it was my fault for not warning him it wasn't stable. My punishment? No TV for a week. Derek? He got ice cream and a lesson in engineering. That's pretty much how it always went. If Derek did something dumb, it was adventurous. If I did the exact same thing, I was irresponsible. He was spirited, I was difficult. There was this invisible scoreboard in the family, and I swear it worked like this. Derek breathes, 10 points. I save someone from choking on a grape, maybe half a point if they're feeling generous. By middle school, I stopped trying to compete. What was the point? Derek got a new bike for no reason. I got his old one, still caked in mud and with half the gears slipping. He got a room with a TV and an Xbox. I got the tiny room with the slanted ceiling and a window that didn't close right. I once got grounded for talking back when I corrected my mom's story about who cleaned the garage. It was me. I spent 6 hours doing it. Derek had said he would and then bailed to go hang out with his friends. But because he intended to help, that was apparently good enough. High school was when it started to really eat away at me. Derek was captain of the soccer team, which my parents thought was the greatest accomplishment since man landed on the moon. Every dinner conversation was about his games, his goals, his coaches who saw real potential. Me? I was more into music. I played guitar, sang in a band. We weren't amazing, but we had fun and even booked some local gigs. My parents came to one of them, stayed 20 minutes, and left early because the venue was too loud. They never asked about it again. When Derek got his driver's license, he crashed the car within a month. Totaled it. My parents were furious for about 10 minutes, and then my dad said, "Well, at least he's learning. These are life experiences." I got my license a year later, drove perfectly for 6 months, then scraped a mailbox while parking. My mom cried, like actual tears, said she couldn't believe how careless I was. College was the first time I really escaped. I got into a state school with a decent scholarship, partly from grades, partly from my part-time job. Derek went to some private university out of state, and you'd think he discovered Atlantis. My parents put a bumper sticker on the car. They didn't even ask where I was applying until I got my acceptance letter. But I wasn't bitter. Not yet. I just figured, okay, maybe if I work hard enough, build a life on my own, they'll finally see me for who I really am. So I did. I graduated early, landed a solid job in IT, and by 24, I had a stable income, an apartment I liked, and even a girlfriend, Brianna, who made me feel seen for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Derek floated through jobs, got fired from 2, moved back in with our parents, and yet still got praised for figuring himself out. But here's where things really started to go sideways. Last Thanksgiving, I offered to host. I figured I'd cook, make the place look nice, and maybe, just maybe, get a little acknowledgement. I went all out. Cleaned the place, made a turkey from scratch, even learned how to make my mom's weird cranberry orange thing that nobody actually likes, but she always insists on. The night before, Derek called to say he couldn't make it. No reason. Just something came up. I was disappointed, but didn't say anything. My parents showed up late, didn't comment on the food, and spent the entire dinner talking about how Derek had just started another new job, something in creative marketing, whatever that means. They kept saying how brave he was for pursuing his passion. At one point, my dad asked if I'd considered helping Derek with his resume. "You're good with computers, right?" he said, like I was some IT guy at Best Buy. "I actually run system architecture for a mid-sized firm. I design networks. But sure, I'll fix Derek's printer too." After dinner, I was cleaning up alone while my mom looked at photos of Derek's new puppy on her phone. She showed me one and said, "Isn't he so responsible? Taking care of a living thing like that." I looked at her and said, "You do know I've lived alone for 3 years now. Pay my own rent, handle my bills, haven't asked you for a dime. That doesn't count." She just smiled and said, "Well, you've always been so independent." That was the moment I realized it. They weren't going to see me. Not ever. Not unless I screwed up so badly that they had to fix me. That's what they responded to. Derek messed up, and he got love. I stayed steady, and I got ignored. It's a weird thing to admit, but I started testing it. I didn't call for 2 months, not a single message from them. When I finally texted my mom, she replied, "Oh honey, we were just talking about Derek's new promotion. Did you hear?" No, I didn't. Because no one tells me anything. It's like I'm some distant relative they forget exists unless I reach out first. And if I try to talk about it, I'm being dramatic or making everything about me. I'm tired. Tired of being the good son who gets nothing. Tired of pretending it doesn't bother me. Tired of being the backup, the second option, the invisible one. I don't want to cut them off completely, but I've stopped trying to earn points on a scoreboard that was rigged from the start. If they want a relationship, they can meet me halfway. But I'm not holding my breath. I still remember the day I broke my arm like it was yesterday. I was 9, running around the school playground during recess when I slipped off the jungle gym and landed hard on my left arm. The pain hit fast and sharp, like lightning through my bones, and my wrist was already starting to swell by the time the nurse called my mom. I figured she'd rush over, maybe with Derek in the back seat, and we'd go straight to the hospital. But instead, she told the school she'd meet me at the emergency room because Derek had soccer practice and she couldn't leave him hanging. So they called a cab for me. 9 years old, crying, holding my arm against my chest, riding in the back of a yellow cab to the hospital by myself. When I got to the ER, the front desk lady gave me a sympathetic look, but rules were rules. I had to sit in the waiting area until my guardian arrived. I sat there for 3 hours. 3 full hours in a hard plastic chair with my jacket balled up under my arm to keep it steady, surrounded by strangers coughing and groaning. A nurse gave me an ice pack at one point, but that was it. When my mom finally walked in, she looked more annoyed than worried. Her first words weren't, "Are you okay?" or "Let me see your arm." No, it was, "Why didn't you call me again when you got here?" I lost track of time at the field. That kind of summed up everything, really. Derek's schedule, Derek's activities, Derek's everything always took precedence. It wasn't just preference. It was policy. There was a hierarchy in our house, and I was firmly at the bottom of it. When I think about my dad, what I remember most isn't a specific moment, but a voice. His voice, always saying things like, "Why can't you be useful like your brother?" No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Derek helped mow the lawn one Saturday, and it was like he'd saved the neighborhood from ruin. I fixed the kitchen sink on my own after watching 2 hours of tutorials on YouTube, and his reaction was, "What took you so long?" I used to bring home certificates from school, perfect attendance, honor roll, stuff that, for a kid, feels like a big deal. One time, I got a diploma for outstanding performance in science. I was in 7th grade and had worked for weeks on this project about renewable energy. I even stayed after school to make a mini wind turbine that actually lit up a small bulb. I was proud of it. I came home, showed it to my dad, and he gave it a quick glance before muttering, "Even a blind squirrel finds a nut." Then he went back to watching TV. I just stood there holding the paper like it might turn into something else if I stared at it long enough. It became this running joke that nothing I did really counted. I got into advanced math in 8th grade, and my mom said, "That's nice, honey," while pouring orange juice, like I had told her the weather. When Derek passed his driving test on the second try, we had a dinner out at his favorite steakhouse. When I passed mine on the first try, I got to borrow the car to go pick up groceries. After a while, I just stopped announcing things. I didn't tell them when I got an A in calculus, or when my English teacher said my short story could have been published in the school lit magazine. I stopped expecting them to care. I didn't want to give them another opportunity to shrug or joke or compare me to Derek like I was some knockoff version of their actual son. Sometimes I'd think maybe I was imagining it, that maybe I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. But then something else would happen, like the time I overheard my mom on the phone with a friend, bragging about Derek's internship while saying, "Oliver's doing computer stuff, I think." Nothing exciting. Or when my dad introduced me at a neighborhood cookout by saying, "This one's the quiet one. Keeps to himself. Not like his brother." It all added up. 1,000 little moments that told me I was tolerated, not treasured, present, but not important. And no matter what I did, I was always second place in a race I didn't even know we were running. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from living in a house full of people who act like you're not really there. I think the worst part is how subtle it is. It's not always yelling or insults or slamming doors. Sometimes it's the way your name never gets called, the way your preferences are never considered, the way people walk past you in the kitchen like you're just another appliance humming quietly in the corner. It was always little things. My mom would come home from the store with bags full of snacks, and without even looking, I already knew none of them were for me. Doritos Cool Ranch, Derek's favorite. Honeycrisp apples, which he insisted were better than the regular kind. His specific brand of protein bars, the ones I once tried and was told not to eat because they were his. Meanwhile, I'd open the fridge and find maybe a half-eaten yogurt I'd forgotten I bought myself. And if I said anything, just a quiet, "Hey," Could you grab something for me next time? I'd get a distracted, sure, that never meant anything. I eventually stopped saying anything at all. It was easier that way. Then there was the washing machine. It broke during my last year of high school, started leaking all over the floor in the middle of a cycle. My dad groaned, said we'd probably need a new one, that it'd be at least $300 to replace. I told him to give me a couple days. I watched videos online, looked up parts, spent an entire weekend pulling the thing apart in the garage and putting it back together. I figured it out. A busted hose and a jammed pump. Cost me $30 and a lot of time. When I finally got it working again, I was proud. Actually felt useful for once. You know what my dad said when I showed him? Put it back the way it was. You probably broke something else. Not, good job. Not, thanks for saving us money. Just this immediate distrust, like anything I touched was automatically worse. He didn't even look at it. He just assumed I'd messed it up. I remember standing there, hands covered in grease and detergent water, and realizing it didn't matter what I did. The best I could ever hope for was indifference. Usually, it was just disappointment. By the time I was 16, I'd stopped asking for anything. Every time I needed something, new shoes, a jacket, school supplies, the answer was always the same. We don't have the money. And maybe I could have believed that, if it weren't for the new tablet Derek got for his birthday that year. It was some fancy thing with a case and a stylus and everything. I hadn't even known he wanted one. He probably mentioned it in passing, and they just made it happen. I remember looking at it sitting on the kitchen table, brand new and untouched, while I was still using a school-issued Chromebook that barely booted up. That's the kind of thing that stays with you. Not the big moments, but the repetition. The slow drip of being reminded, again and again, that you come second. That you're forgettable. That you can fix something that saves your family hundreds of dollars and still be treated like a liability. Even now, thinking about it, I don't really feel angry. Just tired. Tired of carrying this quiet, invisible weight around all the time. Tired of pretending it didn't bother me every time they celebrated Derek like he was the only one worth noticing. It's not that I wanted them to ignore him. I just wanted them to see me, too. But they didn't. And over time, I stopped expecting them to. The only person who ever really saw me was my grandfather Ray. He wasn't loud or emotional, never the type to smother you with praise or ask too many questions. He was just present, in this quiet way that somehow meant more than any of the words my parents ever threw around. He didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened, because there was always something behind it, something that felt real. When I was 13, I remember sitting on the back porch with him one summer afternoon. I was messing around with an old broken radio I'd pulled from the garage, trying to figure out how it worked. He didn't say anything at first, just watched for a while, sipping his coffee. Then he got up, went to his truck, and came back holding this faded blue toolbox. He set it down beside me, opened the lid, and inside was a full set of tools, not the cheap kind either, solid, well-used, clearly cared for. He didn't make a speech or anything, just said, "Maybe this will come in handy," and gave me this little nod before going back inside. That's it. No performance, no need to explain. But it hit me harder than anything my parents had ever done. He was like that, always paying attention, even if no one else was. A few months later, my 8th grade class was planning a trip to DC for a week. I wanted to go more than anything. Everyone was talking about it, and it felt like something I'd remember forever. But when I brought it up at home, my mom just waved it off, said, "We can't afford it right now." My dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. "It's just a bunch of monuments and buses," he said. "You'll live." I remember going to my room and sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to pretend I didn't care. That weekend, I was over at Grandpa Ray's place helping him clean out his shed when he handed me an envelope. "Heard your class is taking a trip," he said, like he was commenting on the weather. Inside was the full cost of the trip in cash. "Don't tell your folks. Just go and take some pictures." That last part confused me until the following week, when he gave me an old but perfectly working digital camera, the kind with manual settings, and a strap that still smelled faintly of tobacco. "Figured you might want to give this a try," he said, as casual as ever. He never said he was proud of me in those exact words, but it was there, in the way he showed up, in the things he noticed, in the quiet way he supported what I was interested in even when no one else bothered to ask. When I started taking photography more seriously, he'd sometimes slip me a roll of film or send me articles he'd clipped from newspapers, stuff about light composition or landscapes. He never acted like it was some big deal, but somehow, that made it feel even more important. He was the only one who didn't compare me to Derek. He didn't tell me to be more like him or remind me how much more athletic or outgoing he was. With Grandpa Ray, I didn't feel like I had to perform. I didn't have to win his approval or beg for attention. He just gave it freely, in his own quiet way. And when everything else in that house felt cold or dismissive or like I was invisible, he was the one steady thing. The one person who made me feel like maybe I wasn't the problem after all. Getting into college was supposed to be this big milestone, the kind of moment you imagine your whole family rallying behind you, offering congratulations, maybe even shedding a tear or two. For me, it was just paperwork, bus tickets, and silence. I got in on my own, filled out the applications, handled the FAFSA, tracked the deadlines, scheduled the meetings. There wasn't a single offer of help from my parents. No questions, no encouragement, not even a good job. It was like I was planning a vacation instead of starting a new chapter of my life. When orientation week came, I packed my things in the back of my grandfather's pickup. He was the only one who even acknowledged I was leaving. No send-off from my mom. No handshake or advice from my dad. Just Grandpa Ray, waiting outside at 7 in the morning with his thermos of black coffee, nodding like we were about to haul lumber instead of move me into a dorm. He helped me carry everything in, 2 suitcases, a box of books, my guitar, and the same toolbox he'd given me years earlier. He didn't say much while we unpacked, just gave me space to get settled. When we finished, he looked around the room, nodded once, and handed me an envelope. $500, he said, for when things get tight. Don't blow it on pizza. Then he clapped me on the shoulder and left. No speech, no big goodbye. But I stood there for a long time after the door shut, holding that envelope like it weighed more than it did. My parents didn't call. Not when I moved in. Not during orientation. Not that week or the next. I don't know if they even knew what day I left. I texted my mom once to let her know I got there, just out of habit. She responded 12 hours later with a thumbs-up emoji. That was it. From that moment on, I didn't go back. Not for weekends, not for breaks. I got a job on campus working late shifts at the library and tutoring underclassmen in math. I took summer courses to stay busy, applied for grants, picked up extra shifts. The more time passed, the less I thought about home. It stopped feeling like home anyway. Holidays were the only time they remembered I existed. A Thanksgiving text from my mom that just said, "Hope you're eating." A stiff, "Merry Christmas" from my dad that felt more like an obligation than anything heartfelt. I'd respond politely, sometimes not at all. There wasn't any anger behind it anymore. Just distance. Like we were playing roles in a performance none of us cared about. I didn't even tell them when I changed majors or when I got promoted to a lead tutor. I didn't tell them about the project I worked on that won a small departmental award. It wasn't worth the silence or, worse, the forced "that's nice, son," with no follow-up. I saved those stories for my grandfather, even though I knew he didn't need the details. He just wanted to know I was okay. He didn't need me to impress him. That, more than anything, made me want to do well. And somehow, without fanfare or support, I started building something of my own. For the first time in my life, I was completely untethered, not drifting, but steering. And that made all the difference. When my grandfather Ray died, the world didn't stop, but something in me did. He'd been sick for a while, though no one in the family really talked about it. He never made a big deal of anything, not even his own decline. I got a short call from my mom. No emotion, just, "Your grandfather passed last night. The funeral's on Saturday. Dress formal." That was it. She hung up before I could say anything. The ceremony was stiff and cold, exactly the way he wouldn't have wanted it. Everyone put on their best clothes and their fakest faces. My mom sobbed too loudly, like she was trying to convince the room she'd been close to him. My dad just looked around like he was waiting for someone important to arrive. Derek stood in the back, texting through half the service. I stayed quiet, like always, sitting in the second row, feeling the weight of losing the only person who ever really made an effort to understand me. A week later, I was back in my apartment when I got the call. It was a lawyer, someone representing my grandfather's estate. He asked if I could come in for a formal reading of the will. I figured maybe there was a photo or an old pocket knife or something he wanted me to have. Something small and meaningful. I didn't think much of it. When I arrived, my parents and Derek were already there, sitting on one side of the long conference table in the lawyer's office. They looked annoyed, like they'd been waiting too long. My mom gave me a glance that didn't say hello so much as, "What are you doing here?" I didn't respond. The lawyer came in, introduced himself, and opened the folder on the desk in front of him. He began reading the will in that slow, deliberate way lawyers always do in movies. My grandfather had left detailed instructions. A few personal items were given to extended family members, a watch here, a rifle there, some old war medals. And then came the big part. The property, the house, the land, the savings accounts, the investments. 2 cars. Everything. All of it was left to me. I remember the room going completely silent. My mother's mouth actually dropped open, like she'd been slapped. My father blinked hard a few times, then leaned forward in his chair like maybe he had misheard. Derek made this scoffing noise and said, "Wait, what?" As if someone had just told him the sky was green. "There must be a mistake," my mother said, her voice low and sharp. "Ray wouldn't have done that. He must have meant to divide it." The lawyer looked up without a hint of emotion. This was a conscious, formal decision. The documents were signed and notarized 6 months before Mr. Ray's death. There's no ambiguity in the language. Everything goes to Oliver. She kept shaking her head, as if doing it enough would reverse the words. My father didn't say anything, just sat back in his chair and stared at the wall. Derek leaned over and muttered something under his breath that I didn't catch, but the bitterness was clear. I think for the first time in their lives, they realized I wasn't just some background character in the family story. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, numb, with my hands folded in my lap, while my grandfather gave me one final message, even from the grave. He'd seen everything. He always had. It didn't take long for the messages to start. At first, they were subtle. A few texts from my mom with that cloying sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "We have always loved you. Let's talk about it, sweetheart. Your grandfather wouldn't want us divided like this." No mention of the will. No mention of how they sat in stunned silence while the lawyer read it. Just this vague, polished language, as if rewriting history with enough soft words would erase everything else. Then came my dad. He started showing up outside my apartment unannounced. I didn't let him in. I couldn't. The first time, he stood on the porch with his arms crossed and said, "Look, I know this is complicated, but it would be right to divide everything into 2. Your brother is older. He needs more. He's trying to build his life." I stood there in the doorway, listening to the same tone he used when I was a kid, the one that always made it clear I wasn't the one worth investing in. I didn't say anything, just shut the door and walked away. Derek's message came a few days later, and it was something else entirely. No politeness, no pretending, just pure venom. "You stole what was supposed to be mine. You manipulator. You turned Grandpa against us and made him think you were some kind of saint. This is low, even for you." I read it twice, then put my phone down and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I wasn't surprised exactly, but seeing it written out like that, seeing how fast he snapped, it still hit hard. After that, it escalated. They started reaching out to extended family, friends, even some of my old classmates back home. I started hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in years, saying things like, "Your mom told me you've been struggling mentally," or "Your dad said you've been influenced by things." The words they used were careful, vague enough to be slippery, but the meaning was clear. They were painting me as unstable, zombified, manipulated, as if my grandfather hadn't made his own decisions, hadn't seen things clearly right until the end. At one point, I got a call from a family friend, someone I respected growing up, and she said, "Oliver, I don't want to pick sides, but your mom's been really heartbroken. She says this has destroyed the family." That was the moment I realized they weren't just trying to pressure me. They were trying to control the narrative, turn me into the villain so they could play the victims, make people forget the years of silence, the way they overlooked me, the way they left me behind over and over again. They wanted a piece of the inheritance. That was the truth, plain and simple. And when they realized they couldn't shame me into handing it over, they went for guilt. They weaponized their tears, their regret, their years of willful ignorance. They tried to twist my loyalty to my grandfather into something dirty, something selfish. But the part that stung the most, the part one didn't say out loud, was that they didn't even care why he left it all to me. They never once asked. Not what I meant to him. Not what he meant to me. They didn't want the truth. They just wanted what they thought they were entitled to. I should have expected it, but part of me still hoped they wouldn't go that far. Maybe I thought they'd give up once it became clear I wasn't budging. Maybe I underestimated how deep their entitlement ran. Or maybe I just didn't want to believe that my own family would try to erase everything my grandfather and I had shared just to get their hands on what he left behind. But then the papers came. A formal notice. They were suing me. The claim was almost laughable if it hadn't been so infuriating. They accused me of manipulating my grandfather in his final months, saying I'd influenced him, taken advantage of his declining health to rewrite the will in my favor. They said he hadn't been of sound mind, that I had isolated him, coerced him, made him believe lies about them. It was everything they weren't brave enough to say to my face, written out in neat legal language and dropped at my doorstep like some kind of warning shot. I took the documents straight to my lawyer. He read through them slowly, flipping pages with that deliberate calm that only made me more tense. When he was done, he nodded and said, "The will's solid. It's properly signed, witnessed, and filed. There's no question about its legality. Then he looked up and added, but they can drag this out for years if they want to. They don't have to win to make it painful. That was the game. Not justice. Not truth. Just pressure. If they couldn't make me give it up willingly, they'd try to bleed me dry, inch by inch. But they underestimated me again. What they didn't know was that I'd already started collecting everything. I'd been too close to my grandfather not to feel the shift coming. In those last few months, he had become quieter, yes, but not confused. He was reflective, intentional. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he had told me more than once to keep receipts, just in case. So I did. I gathered everything. Every record of the checks he wrote to cover my parents' debts, the second mortgage they never paid back, the medical bill advances they always promised to figure out later, the time he covered Derek's tuition after my dad said he needed to learn responsibility. I had handwritten notes where my grandfather logged the money, complete with dates and notations like not repaid. I had receipts from grocery runs, pharmacy pickups, utility bills, all the errands I ran for him alone, because they were always too busy or too tired or just didn't care. I even had a log he kept of calls. Every missed holiday, every forgotten birthday, every time Derek promised to visit and didn't. My name was the one that appeared over and over again. Not because I asked him to write it down, but because he did. Quietly. Like he was building his own defense before anyone could accuse him of being confused. I handed everything over to my lawyer in a thick binder. He spent 2 days going through it and then reached out to their attorney. What followed wasn't a court hearing. It was a meeting. One offer. Clear and final. Withdraw the lawsuit or lose publicly and loudly. There was no threat. Just documentation. Proof that everything they claimed was false. Proof that they had taken and taken for years while giving nothing in return. Proof that if they wanted a war, they'd get one, not just in legal terms, but in reputation, legacy, and truth. For once, they had no clever comebacks. No guilt trips. No fake concern. Just silence. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what my grandfather had done. He hadn't just left me his house or his money. He had left me the strength to stand alone. It happened on a quiet afternoon, weeks after the lawsuit was dropped and the storm had finally passed. I was cleaning out my grandfather's office, or what I thought was just his office. I had put it off for a while, partly out of exhaustion, partly because it still smelled like him. A mix of old paper, pipe tobacco, and something woodsy I could never quite place. The room had always been a mystery to me, filled with shelves of dusty books, filing cabinets that never seemed to get opened, and a massive desk that creaked when you leaned on it. I was sorting through a bottom drawer when I found it. A small, heavy box tucked behind some ledgers. It was locked, but the key was taped under the drawer, like he had wanted it to be found, just not too easily. I sat on the floor with the box in my lap for a long time before opening it. I don't know what I expected. Old war medals, maybe. A stack of savings bonds. But inside was something else entirely. A letter. And a sealed envelope with lab paperwork inside. I read the letter first. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Neat, steady, no hesitation. It began with my name, written in full. Oliver, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And the truth is finally where it belongs, in your hands. I felt my chest tighten as I kept going. He explained everything. How years ago, long before I was old enough to understand, there had been a brief affair, one mistake, one moment that turned into a lifetime. My mother had agreed to raise me as her husband's child, in exchange for what he called future benefits. He didn't go into detail, but I didn't need him to. I knew what he meant. A stable life, the image of a perfect family, access to his wealth. A transaction, not a decision of love. He wrote that she had grown to resent me, not just for who I was, but for what I represented, a crack in the polished surface she tried so hard to maintain. And my father, the man I had called Dad my whole life, had never truly accepted me. He raised me in name only, and even then, barely. Ray had stayed on the sidelines, not because he didn't care, but because he thought it would be easier for everyone. He said he believed the family should have a chance to stay intact, and that stepping in might destroy what little structure I had. But over the years, as he watched from the edges, he saw the way I was treated, saw the indifference, the neglect, the quiet punishments for things I couldn't control. He said he tried to keep his distance, but watching me grow up the way I did broke something in him. He wrote that he started helping in small ways at first, the tools, the camera, the money for the trip, and then realized he was just trying to make up for the time he'd already lost. The more he gave, the more he saw me as not just a boy who deserved better, but as his son. His words, my son. At the bottom of the box was the DNA test, signed and notarized, confirming what the letter had already said. He was not my grandfather. He was my father. I sat there for a long time, the paper shaking slightly in my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just let the truth settle around me, like dust in a quiet room. All the little things that had never made sense suddenly did. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way he always showed up when no one else did. The way he never asked for anything in return. He had left me everything in his will. But this was the real inheritance, the truth. Not just about who I was, but who I'd always been. The courtroom was cold, sterile, the kind of place where people spoke in low tones and avoided eye contact. I sat at the table next to my lawyer, the final day of the hearing already heavy in the air. For months, they had pushed, twisted the story, tried to paint me as the manipulator, the ungrateful grandson who had schemed his way into an inheritance. But that morning, I brought the one thing none of them were prepared for. The DNA test. It wasn't part of the original case, but after finding the letter and the documents in the box, my lawyer advised we include it in the final filing. Not to provoke, but to confirm. When the judge asked if there was anything additional to submit into evidence, my lawyer stood and placed the sealed envelope on the table. Your Honor, we'd like to submit a certified DNA test showing that Mr. Ray Hensley was not the decedent's grandson, but in fact, his biological son. The room went still. The family's lawyer looked down, said nothing. No objection. No questions. Just silence. Across the aisle, my mother's face drained of color. My father stared straight ahead, hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles turned white. And Derek, for the first time since this all began, looked completely lost. Like something had been knocked loose that he didn't know how to put back. The judge leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. Is this accurate? Did you know about this? He asked, addressing my parents directly. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her jaw trembled slightly, eyes wet, but no words. My father gave a short nod, slow and stiff, like it physically hurt him to admit it. There it was. No denials. No dramatics. Just the truth, sitting bare in the room. The judge didn't take long. The case was dismissed. The will was upheld in full. The estate remained mine. There were no raised voices, no final accusations, no last-minute attempts to change the outcome. Just paperwork and the sound of chairs scraping as everyone stood to leave. I didn't look at them when it ended. I didn't need to. I already knew what I would see. People who weren't just defeated, but exposed. After that day, they stopped. No more messages. No phone calls. No appearances at my door or stories told to family friends. It was as if, once the truth was out, they didn't know what to do with themselves anymore. They had spent so long trying to rewrite the story that when the real one finally emerged, it left them with nothing to stand on. And just like that, the noise ended. The fight was over. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. And for once, I could live in it without looking over my shoulder. It had been 4 months since the trial ended, 4 months of complete silence. Not a text, not a call, not even a secondhand message passed through someone else. And then one afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees and the wind picked up through the fence I was fixing, I heard the gravel crunch under slow tires. I turned my head, and there they were, my parents, standing awkwardly by the edge of the driveway, looking smaller than I ever remembered them. They didn't walk all the way up to the porch, just stood there near the yard like they weren't sure if they were allowed to come closer. My mom was wringing her hands, her lips pressed into a tight, forced smile. My dad had his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground, like maybe it would swallow him if he stared hard enough. I didn't say anything, just kept working on the fence, replacing a rotted board and tightening the hinges on the gate. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Eventually, my mother stepped forward. Oliver, she said, almost too softly to hear. Can we talk? I didn't respond. Not right away. Then she added, it's about Derek. I turned, slowly, wiped my hands on my jeans, and waited. He's gone, she said. He left. Vanished 2 weeks ago. Took off with a credit card that wasn't his. We found out he's been hiding from lenders for months. He's in trouble. A lot of trouble. She looked at me like she expected me to fill the silence with sympathy. Or shock. Or maybe guilt. I gave her nothing. My dad cleared his throat and stepped forward. We need help, he said. You have the resources now. We're your family. I looked at him, then at her, then back at the half-fixed fence. My hands were still on the hammer, but I wasn't holding it tight anymore. I didn't feel anger. Not anymore. I felt the weight of everything that had built up over the years pressing right up against that moment, and I felt calm. I spoke without raising my voice. Ray was my family. You are not. Neither of them responded. My mom opened her mouth, but whatever words she was about to say collapsed before they reached me. My dad looked like he might try again, but thought better of it. There was nothing left to say. I turned back to the fence, adjusted the board, and lined up the next nail. I heard the car door open, then another. Then the engine started. And just like that, they were gone. The sound of the hammer striking would echoed across the yard, steady and final. The house is quiet now. Not heavy or tense like the silence I grew up with, but clean, honest silence. The kind you settle into instead of bracing against. Ray's house, my house now, sits on the edge of a small ridge just outside town, and in the late afternoons, the light comes in through the western windows like it's supposed to be here. I fixed the gate, rebuilt the porch railing, refinished the floors in the study where he used to read. There's peace in that work, in shaping something with my own hands, knowing I answer to no one but myself. I don't look over my shoulder anymore. I don't wait for a call that won't come, or hold my breath hoping someone might finally see me. I'm not trying to prove anything. Not trying to earn a place in someone else's script. I live. I work. I rest. I eat what I like. Wake when I want. Speak only when I feel like it. I go whole days without thinking about them. And when I do, it doesn't hurt. They chose Derek. Again and again, they made that choice. Even when he ran. Even when he lied. Even when he left them holding nothing but excuses and bills. He was their investment, their mirror, their hope. And they lost him. Not because of me, not because of Ray, but because they never believed there would be a consequence for turning their backs on the wrong son. But I didn't just win. I endured. I watched the foundation crack and stood where it fell. I held the truth when no one wanted to hear it. I took every cold shoulder, every insult passed off as a joke, every empty birthday, and every one-sided holiday, and I didn't fold. I stayed standing. I stayed me. And now I am done. I'll never be their backup plan. Never be their fallback, their second option, their safe choice when things fall apart. They taught me I was disposable. Ray showed me I wasn't. That difference is the line I stand on now, and I will never cross it again. So that's my story. I'm curious, what would you have done in my place? Would you have let them back in? Would you have stayed silent or fought? What do you think Ray saw that they never did? Let me know your thoughts. I'd really like to hear them.